Welcome everybody to the Earth Day Green 50. Today we're going to share with you a little bit about the project. It's the first of its kind that we know of, where business journalists and Earth Day organizations have come together to try and identify the 50 business moves in the last 50 years that have moved the Earth in a consequentially positive way. And so to kick it off, I'd like to invite a fellow raconteur, Pierre Lussier, who heads up Earth Day Canada and was the person who planted the seed for this idea. So I'd like to turn it over to Pierre to share with us why we did the Green 50. Pierre?
Thank you, Toby. Thank you to Corporate Knights who follow us on this Earth Day 2020 50th anniversary. So it was important for us to do the 50 moves that help the planet because, as John will talk a little bit about it, or we believe at Earth Day Initiative and Earth Day Canada, we believe that if you do one thing, if there's one thing you can do, this is going to make a change. So corporate and businesses are welcome to their important people towards the planet, or their important organization that can impact the planet. Then a good thing, and one good thing that you can do on the planet will be remembered as we do it today, that we remember these moves. And this is kind of this is what drove us towards this 50 business move with Corporate Knights.
Thank you, Pierre. Adria Vasil is the managing editor at Corporate Knights. She oversaw a lot of this project, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, and was in touch and went through every one of the different nominations. And she's also, some of you may know her, she's the author of the Ecoholic book series. It's a series of books on how to bring your environmental chops to what you buy and how to cut through the greenwash. And so Adria is an ideal person to do this, because if you can make it through Adria's filter, that means you're doing something legitimately solid. So Adria, maybe you could share with us a little bit about how we did this, how we came up with the Green 50, and what you found out.
Well, it was definitely a beast of a project. We decided to open the nomination process to our readers, to people across North America, around the world, to submit their nominations for their ideas on which business moves actually qualify to be in this Green 50. And Corporate Knights contacted close to 1,000 thought leaders, sorry, 100 thought leaders. 100 kept us busy enough, but 100 thought leaders in various sectors and industries to get their input. And from there, our expert judges on the panel before you whittled it down to a short list of 50, and here we are now with the top 50 before us. A lot of blood, sweat, and tears went into this list, as you said, Toby. A lot of research went into fact checking. A lot of companies didn't make the cut. It was a grueling process, but really interesting and revealing to see kind of the shifts over time, and actually for many of us on staff to learn more about some of the business moves that really were impactful in shifting the tides on in so many areas. And it was interesting to see over time the kind of momentum build as well, and the sheer volume of green corporate acts. That in the 70s we have kind of a trickle happening. At that point it was more regulatory actions that we're seeing coming from government, and we had the visionary, mission-driven founders, like the founders behind Patagonia and Body Shop, really take the lead. And even companies like SC Johnson that decided to ban ozone-depleting CFCs years before the government mandated them doing it. They didn't even have an alternative for making their aerosol products that were CFC-free at that time, and decided to just pull their products off the shelves. Whereas other companies like DuPont didn't make the list for CFCs as well. DuPont had actually backed the Montreal Protocol to phase out CFCs around the globe, a very important business move that happened when they decided to back the Montreal Protocol on phasing out CFCs. But at the same time, we though DuPont was nominated, we didn't end up selecting them because they had spent years really undermining the science against CFCs. And we're late to the party. So it was an interesting judging process, deciding who would and wouldn't make the list. But you know, we also ended up with a list that was probably half European and UK based in the end. A lot of interesting companies from Canada, a big chunk from the US, and some interesting players from China and Japan and India as well. Definitely a deep dive project. I encourage everyone to read every word till the end. Lots to learn there, but a lot for us to unpack today as well.
Thanks, Adria. And we have with us John Oppermann. He's the Executive Director of the Earth Day Initiative based in the US. And John, what are some of the takeaways? I guess we have some of the people who are watching this will be business leaders, people running businesses. Some of them will be activists. Some of them will be people involved in public policy, and some of them will just be, you know, normal people who are curious. But what would you say were some of the takeaways for some of the different groups out there from this project, and maybe share those with us?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I've said this many times when I've talked to a lot of people about the sort of situation we're in right now. We seem to be experiencing a sort of moment around climate in the last year or so. And I think that that's been a build. And I think over the years, you watch how sustainability marketing and interest in sustainability from the corporate sector ebbs and flows. So I don't think it's been necessarily a linear trajectory, but it's been an upward movement with sort of peaks and dives as we've seen over the years. And I think that you can probably, now that I'm thinking about this, you could probably see that a bit in the various corporate decisions that we took a look at here, that perhaps there were certain periods when it peaked and then maybe there was a little bit of an ebb. And right now, like I said, we are experiencing this moment around climate that really all hands on deck. So the moment with Greta Thunberg being named Time Person of the Year, making the cover of that magazine, Oxford Dictionary naming climate crisis word of the year, it's really broken through to the mainstream in a way that we have never seen before. And we've seen interest in climate change, but it's really reached a critical mass that I think that anyone who is not on board is really going to be left behind. So highlighting the successes of some of the leaders, I think also representing the diversity in terms of the different approaches to it, where I think the list is interesting in that there are some, which Adria alluded to, that their real mission is around this, where they are founded on sustainability. They are really grounded in sustainability as their business model, and it's very much part of their ethos and their brand and their mission, both internally and externally. But then there's some where they're kind of the companies that everyone has heard of, household names, but you wouldn't necessarily associate them with sustainability, but highlighting some of those examples of them actually adopting sustainability in a really impactful way, I think also helps highlight the diversity of the companies that are really all about this. That is their core mission, that is their branding. And then there are the ones that aren't necessarily around that, but there's two different approaches there. So it kind of provides a roadmap of different inspiration around all of that. I think another theme here that I would want to emphasize, which was talked about a lot in a virtual event that we hosted yesterday. So we had a virtual Earth Day 50 kickoff event where we had various guest speakers. We had messages from Al Gore, Elizabeth Warren, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, a range of climate scientists, activists, some folks involved in the private sector. But one of the themes that we heard throughout the entire thing was that a lot of the sustainability solutions are there. There are many things that you can do from an individual level to an organizational level, companies, governments. There are technologies, there are business practices, there are solutions that exist. It's really about the will to implement them. So the more that we can share these ideas, the better. That you can actually learn from each other. You can learn about the different technologies. If you look at, for instance, the Project Drawdown initiative that highlights all of the different ways that we could actually bring down emissions, if you take a look at that and figure out, okay, these are all the different things that we could actually do if only the will were there. I think that we have seen that to some extent in global climate talks. So if you attend any of these global climate talks over the last decade or so, often there's a bit of resignment to things not actually happening. So there's not a lot of action at the national or international level. So what I've seen at those summits is people of all different levels are really interacting and working together, where it's some municipal government, regional government, private sector businesses, large and small, NGOs, large and small. All of these different players are saying, oh, here's this thing that we're doing over here around waste. Here's another thing we're doing over here on energy. How can we learn from each other? How can we work together? So I think that there's a lot of ambition there. And we saw that, especially after the US government announced that it would be pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement. It was sort of that ambition to move forward on steroids, because people really reacted by that initiative to pull away from the Paris Climate Agreement, that people, including in the private sector and business, said, well, we're going to move forward regardless. So there are a lot of examples of people moving forward. And I think a list like this helps highlight those and draws attention to these kind of lessons that can be learned.
Everyone's welcome. Again, we don't need the videos, but we would love to have any questions you might have. You can enter them in the chat, and then I can see who you are and unmute you. Apparently some people know how to unmute themselves, as we're discovering. But before we get to that, I have a couple of questions, and I'll monitor the questions as well. And if people just want to put them in the comment box, I can also ask them if you say you just want me to ask them in the comment box. So first one, this is for all of the panelists. In this time, you know, we're in the middle of the health crisis right now. That's not lost on any of us. It's made us all Zoomers, with apologies to Moses Znaimer. But it's a serious matter, and people are pretty preoccupied with the health crisis. That's the first order of business. There's going to be a recovery that comes after the health crisis, and we have to be thinking about what that recovery will look like at the same time. And I'm wondering, in terms of, you know, the different reflections and changes, and the place we find ourselves as citizens of this planet today, at this moment in time in this crisis, as we start to sort of see the light at the end of the tunnel. What relevance does a list like this have, and how might it maybe point the way for what could come next in a hopeful light? Adria?
I mean, I would say that, you know, this is really a moment for, you know, corporate responsibility, everyone's prompt pledges to environmental, social governance to really kind of find their power and step into the light. You know, we've seen from this list, businesses around the world over the last 50 years really stepping up and taking a leadership role and sometimes, you know, some of the leadership came from a lot of pushing from activists and so on, after a lot of pushing, but the point is that they all ended up stepping forward and delivering beyond their competitors to contribute to the greater good of the planet in some way. And I think we're seeing this around the world right now. You know, Corporate Knights is actually launching a new series called COVID Nights, about companies stepping up and to contribute and support their communities in many ways through this time. And it's really just an extension of the kind of calls for just greater corporate responsibility that have been mounting over the last few decades, and especially in the last few years. I think the average consumer, the average person these days, the average millennial demands more from companies. They want to see them being good corporate citizens. They want to see them being purpose-driven in many ways, and we have a lot of purpose-driven companies on this list, and I think that is taking on a new dimension now with COVID and with the pandemic, and so the pandemic is really giving us kind of an opportunity to rethink the way we do things as well. And I think as we step up at this time, and as companies step up, it's important not to forget as well the kind of climate commitments that have been made. And I think that's really, really nice to hear a lot, you know, in conversations these days, that even major investment houses are still pressuring major corporations that yes, we want you to, we want to support you while you're trying to adapt to this, very terrifying time economically and health and on the health front. But at the same time, we're still going to hold you to account on your climate commitments. And we would like to see those go hand in hand, moving forward as we think of new ways to, model our businesses and make sure we deliver, to our communities on the environmental, social, and governance angles. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot to kind of keep your eye on at this point, but I think it is really important that we make sure that the post-COVID recovery is climate focused. But we also have another event happening where we dive into that a bit more on Wednesday too, for anyone who wants to hear about that.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, the COVID situation, I think, is really like a perfect illustration of what has happened to climate over the years in general, that there's always some other thing that seems more front and center, seems more imminent. So if it's the economy, if it's war, if it's some international crisis, there's always something that takes precedent over climate, and climate has always seemed like this intangible, abstract, distant threat that has never really presented itself as a clear and present danger. COVID is now this, where we saw all this momentum around climate over the last year, and I think people were very hopeful about where we were going on climate action in 2020, and then all of a sudden, COVID is obviously very rightfully top of mind for people, but I think that the thing that we and a lot of others are trying to emphasize is that we have to be able to multitask. In the future, with the ever more apparent effects of climate change, we might have to deal with more and more disruptions to business as usual. So we really actually need to be prepared to be able to multitask on multiple fronts, dealing with COVID, dealing with climate action. Don't let this conversation around climate action fade away because of the more clear and present danger of COVID right now, but use this potentially as an opportunity for a green recovery. So there's been so much discussion of the Green New Deal, which the New Deal in America was in the aftermath of the Great Depression. Now we're presented with potentially something like the Great Depression, or at least a significant recession. So now charting a path forward, this is an opportunity where that recovery could be green in terms of policy, but that could also be in terms of the recovery of business. So businesses could put in place plans that are actually more sustainable, more socially conscious, more oriented toward the social good, because there's this opportunity here. It's like so much has been just wiped off the slate that we have a bit of a clean slate going forward. So there is an opportunity to make sure that this is a green recovery, both in the private sector and the public sector.
Thanks, John. Pierre?
Yeah, and as Churchill would say, never waste a good crisis. And I think this is the opportunity also. There's a lot of speculation, and I don't want to speculate about, where is this going to take us. I think what's fascinating, I think, with the parallel with the the climate crisis is kind of a greenhouse gas, we cannot see it, and as COVID, we cannot see it, so there's a resemblance also. But there's also something completely new that even if you're in Japan or in in Pakistan or in Montreal or in New York, we're waiting to get to the grocery store. So a lot of us, it's the first time we're waiting to go to grocery stores. Others have experienced it. So there is something that something is unifying us into this. And what we see in the future is we're together. We want a better future. We want a brighter future. And so you have a group of organization, and of course we're supporting and highlighting the good work from corporation, because this is what we want. This is what we tend to. There's going to be there's going to be a new world, and then there's the old world. And I hope that in the old world, there was this kind of these things that we remember from the old world are the good things that we want to repeat and be in it, and build our new world on to these, engagement from corporation and individual and activism. And I really hope this is my Earth Day. It's about the hope that this is going to happen, that this shift, that we are going to work toward this shift, and it's an opportunity to not waste a good crisis.
And if I could just add briefly, it's been really interesting to see that companies that were actually better performers environmentally, better performers socially, are actually they're actually withstanding the current crisis much better. So even from a responsible investing perspective, those companies with high ESG or environmental social governance scores are actually outperforming conventional companies. And so they are more resilient, and I hope that is an example for other companies that say, look, these green guys over here are actually outperforming us through the pandemic for a variety of reasons, and it's something that we should look towards and hopefully, learn from. And that's the hope moving forward. But it is, I think, very revealing to see that when you look at the numbers.
I think it's interesting just listening to all of your reflection on this. I think what the COVID crisis has really illuminated and made clear in the stark light of day is how brittle our societies are. And we see, this little virus, how it can, basically shut down Western or large parts of the world, billions of people. And also, it's interesting when you look at, how things that we thought were impossible, that were unthinkable, we can actually do on the turn of a dime. And so it really shows, when there is a massive problem, as a species, we know how to come together and focus our collective muscle to solve it. And I think there's a lot of parallels that could be really, they're really hopeful when we tie that to the climate crisis and how we're going to rebuild and recover out of this. Obviously, keeping our eyes on the health crisis and not taking our eyes off that ball. But I think this could be one of those times where the Overton window of what's possible has shifted enough for a once in a generation or once in a century kind of leap. And thank goodness. We actually have the capacity, the capital, and the technology to do it, which wasn't necessarily true, 15, 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago. And so it's in the realm of reachable. We have a great question here. We have a number of good questions. I have my own, but I'm going to preempt mine and ask the questions of some of our attendees. So Sophie Langlois has a good question here, which is kind of cutting to the core of why we did this as well. What are the main drivers and motivators pushing these companies to make big moves in sustainability or acting for the benefit of the environment? And so want to start, we can start with you, Pierre, and then we'll go Adria and John, and you don't all have to pipe in, but if you have something that you would like to say, please pipe in.
Yeah, and like John said, there are companies that are, at the core of their organization, it's sustainability. So the motivation as them is kind of, this is the value of so I guess the motivation is building a company that is going to do, that is the purpose is, work for a better world. But then other organizations, I guess they feel the pressure from the constituent. And also they want to lower their impact, because at some point also it's about efficiency, because your impact is waste, it's kind of if you waste too much, there's a business model to it also, to have a lower, lighter organization.
Agreed on all fronts, really. It's a variety of factors, depends on the organization. So you have those mission-driven founders, you have the ones that have epiphanies, as the founder of Interface did. Actually, the founder of Interface is credited, Ray Anderson, for being green from the beginning, but in all honesty, he says that actually he kept getting company questions from customers to the company asking what they were doing at their carpeting company to be green, and he couldn't answer them. And so he picked up a book. The name of the book again, Toby, is
Paul Hawkins' Ecology of Commerce.
Ecology of Commerce, exactly. And he called that a spirit to the heart moment, where he had an awakening, realized his company needed to become green through and through, and pledged to basically abolish, all impacts of his company, and which they succeeded in doing. As close as you can, as you can as a company. And they, that is one example. But a lot of companies, we found over and over again that regulation is obviously, you know, the best driver, getting everyone to kind of come to the table and make change. But, you know, there are those who want to get ahead of those regulations and go beyond them. But again, the drivers are, you know, for many financial, wanting to beat their competition, and yes, you know, the environmental factors, you know, reducing your costs on the efficiency side, you know, reducing your fuel costs, your energy, water costs, all that are critical, and more companies are coming to the table knowing that it's kind of a win-win. You reduce your impact and you get to, you know, be an environmental leader at the same time. So good PR benefits there for sure. But yeah, there are a whole host of factors I think drive a variety of businesses. What do you think, John?
Yeah, and you guys covered a lot of the good reasons that people are moving towards sustainability that would drive companies to do so. But the only thing I would add is a more recent development, I think, that is interesting, is that a lot of companies are really recognizing just pure resilience. They need to take into account the increasing effects of climate change. So if you see internal memos from various companies that come out now that are leaked in some cases, where there's a real recognition that we have to deal with this, we need to both mitigate and adapt to climate change. And I think that there's increasing recognition of that. And that's a somewhat more recent development in terms of those internal conversations that are happening.
Yeah, if I can add also, I think there's lately what we've seen also, it's the pressure from the employees. They're kind of, this is that I can see a lot of that. This is kind of a management needing to do something, but this is less of a 50 things, you know, and big moves from corporation. But now you see the pressure and the people and the employee, and they just, you know, you need, for the employees, you need the answers, and sometimes they're tough to exactly to find.
I think it was really important to us that Corporate Knights and Earth Day agreed to include the catalysts behind each of the top 50 actions that we included. So if you drill down on our website, you'll see behind every company and the action they undertook. This isn't so much an endorsement of an entire company's corporate legacy, it's the recognition of one particular act that they undertook. But we do make a point of noting the catalyst behind that action, whether it is, you know, prolonged activist campaign, dogging Tembec to change their ways and pledge to convert all of their forests over to FSC certified wood, or, you know, whether it was just science mounting against CFCs, or the science mounting on climate change and science mounting in various areas. We actually had a chance to name a few scientists that were pivotal as catalysts, and of course the media helping to amplify all those messages. It's a real cohort of factors that get a company to move and shift, and we try to acknowledge them, as many of them as possible.
It's been interesting just listening to, so I think you guys touched eloquently on some of those main drivers, and I was trying to synthesize what you were saying. It seems like there's up to 6 kind of main drivers that catalyze these types of change. And Pierre just mentioned the employee side. That probably was pivotal for Microsoft. They're in a war for talent. They advertised that they're going to go carbon negative to the beginning of time for them, and it's pennies on the dollar for them, but it's something that sounds good and is a new norm, and something that can be exciting for employees and prospective employees. And then you mentioned interface, Adria, and then you have people like Elon Musk. There's this sort of leader with the fire in their belly, whether they're born that way or there's a book they read that just. But the thing is that those leaders are few and far between. The problem with Ray Anderson is there was only one Ray Anderson, and we need way more Ray Andersons. But if we're going to have way more Ray Andersons than Elon Musk, then it speaks to a broader cultural context that we're creating. And then the all-important rules. You don't get a good ball game if you don't have an umpire, and you really need the rules to be in place. And we've seen time and again, you can have rules like in the case of OPG here in Ontario. They were forced, burning coal was made illegal by a certain date, and so they had to do that. But they also went and took the biggest point source of coal emissions in North America and then converted it to this massive solar farm as an indigenous partnership initiative that now is feeding the grid. And so there's this innovation opportunities where a regulation can, instead of just spurring compliance, can actually spur innovation. but it is important. And then when you look at Oersted's the most fascinating company for me on this list, because up until recently, they were the blackest, one of the dirtiest companies on the planet, certainly in Europe. And in the span of less than a decade, they were able to transform themselves from a coal power company into the biggest wind offshore producer in the world. And at the same time, increase their market value to over $40 billion and way outperformed their peers in the utilities and the power sector. And their motivation was they hit the wall in 2012 on debt. And Goldman Sachs said, if you want to survive, you got to cut the low margin stuff and go double down on the high margin stuff. And what that meant, and why this is so hopeful, I think, for the movement and what we're working in, is it meant doubling down on wind energy, because that was where the money was. That was where they could make money, and the coal was where they were losing money. And so they doubled down, and now they're almost a pure play renewable energy company. Everyone thought it would take 30 years. It took less than 10, and they're one of the most successful, economically successful companies in their industry. And that wouldn't have been possible 10 years ago or 20 years ago, because the technology didn't allow for that kind of leap to happen. But now we have that technology. So I think the one thing, though, that is worth reflecting on for everyone here and all our listeners is the customers. Because when we run through that whole list of all these catalytic actions, few and far between, almost never do we find the customer being the driver. And I think is information in that connective tissue that holds markets together, and the information gets better and more usable and more trustable in formats and with imprinters like Oersted and from journalists like Adria and organizations like Corporate Knights. Hopefully we can start to see customers starting to pull their weight and play a more powerful role in shaping the direction of markets and our societies. So we have lots of questions. Yeah, please, Adria.
Quickly interject on this on the behalf of customers, because I have been kind of speaking for them, for like the last 15 years, really, and having a conversation with them about using their voice and their buying power to encourage companies to go greener. And I know one of the moves that didn't make the top 50, but was Target as well as Walmart announcing that they're going to be phasing out dozens of chemicals from their personal care products, and then a few other companies. And the reason why that happened was because customers were complaining. Customers were saying, we're not wanting to buy products that have certain ingredients in them. And so while a few of those didn't make the list, it doesn't mean that the consumer isn't actually using their voice to encourage businesses to go green. So I just want to raise that point, because I do think they have been having an impact. It's just that unlike the catalysts that we named on our list, we named specific environmental organizations, we named specific scientists, etc. It's hard to kind of name the every consumer that spoke up for to demand more from the companies they support.
And one other one I forgot was the investor. They weren't pivotal in a lot of the Green 50, but there were a lot that almost made the Green 50. And there's something called the Climate Action 100 Plus, and they're literally causing many of the world's biggest polluters to adopt 2-degree or Paris-based business plans. And we'll have to see how that gets backed up with their capital expenditures and everything. But the investors are starting to flex their muscle in ways that are quite novel and could be quite consequential. So hopefully that will be, they're top of the food chain. So hopefully that will be something that can be a bigger driver going forward as well. Okay, we have questions popping in. I'm going to ask the next one. This one is from Mark, and he's asking, how long do you expect it to take for all corporates to have a sustainability action plan, not just the the 1% leaders? Pierre, do you want to take a first crack?
No, I don't know.
I don't want to put you on the spot.
There's not a corporation, and I don't know. This is it, and again, this is you need to act your business, your sustainability plan. So this is two things, and I'm more focused on acting the sustainability plan. So I don't know, but I hope in the new world they'll. All of them are going to join the sustainability, if they have a plan or not, but they should be part of it, hopefully.
Toby, do you have any thoughts on that one?
So think about it, it's something that happens in a context, if it's going to be at scale and more than just the pioneer leaders that have some psychological experience or inner fire in their belly. And that context is most influentially going to be determined by the foundation of everything, which is, I think, culture. And out of culture springs the kind of norms and the rules that come. And so I think the culture is really a function of expectations of people that have influence, and that spreads. And so the more that everybody expects more from companies, expects them to take care of the environment, expects them to take care of their employees, expects them to generally be decent corporate citizens. I think, sorry, we have another person trying to Zoom bomb us. I'm just seeing. I think that is the expectation. If the moment that all of us expect any bank that we're going to bank with not to be financing things that were egregiously offside of our values, and to be telling us what they're doing with that, and to be asking, demanding, it's really a function of us being a lot more conscious as actors in the marketplace, where we take our business, you know, what kind of car, how we travel, where we bank. And I think the area that has is most ripe for change is the financial sector, because it's a big decision when you decide who you're going to bank with or who you're going to invest with, if you have the capital to invest. And if it starts to become a thing where you can't get clients, or people are jumping to other banks because the banks are not playing ball to finance the future that is worth living in, that a lot of people want, then this stuff gets more consequential. But it's really a function of, if we expect more and we demand more, we will get more out of corporations, and they will be happy to deliver. But it's up to us, and it's up to us to make sure that it's followed through at every level, not just the cultural level, but at the rules level, at the information level, at the infrastructure level, and critically in the sort of investment levels. So but it happens, you know, if we care and we expect, then everything else flows from that.
Yeah, and the only thing that I would add to that, it's a bit of a cliche to say that change is both slow and fast, but I do think that it's true. And we see that with a lot of different social movements, where there's obviously a lot of change that's happening over the course of decades, whether it comes to civil rights, LGBT rights, the environment, whatever it is. There's work that's being done by advocates and by a lot of different groups for decades. But then when the change does happen, it can just seem so quick, because it can swiftly sweep in. And I think we could potentially see that, just to address the question about timeline, with the moment that we're seeing around climate action right now, that the work has been done, obviously pushing for those in power, whether it's business or government, to do the right thing around sustainability for decades. But then when the changes do come, I think we could just potentially be at the cusp of that really sweeping change, where all of a sudden everyone is on board, and we'll sort of see how the next year or so plays out.
So we have a question here from Mark, and it's on the topic of greenwashing, and how, you know, from an investment perspective, if you want to start to commit your savings to something that is more aligned with your values, you know, how difficult is it to do that? Are there any sources, any thoughts, guidance?
Yeah, I can jump in here. I did a piece not too long ago on how the top 5 banks are delivering or not delivering ethical investment options, and how they score. Unfortunately, Canada's big 5 banks don't, generally speaking, have a lot of options. There were 2, RBC and BMO, that actually had ethical investing options, whereas the other 3 big banks did not even deliver any direct-to-consumer themed ethical investing options or environmental sustainable investing options. You will have better luck generally at the you know, Desjardins and Vancities and so on of the world, the more cooperative banks, and they will have more. I also did a piece on robo-advisors, and a lot of greenwash happening with the online, investing apps and robo-advisors claiming to be green. I did a report card on some of those last year, but I think, Toby, we should really refresh that report card, because the scene is changing very rapidly. And I think as companies get called out for their greenwashing on this front, they get held to account. I mean, there was one, I remember, investing app out of the US that I found that claimed to have an animal-friendly investing fund, and then when you actually looked at the companies they were investing, it was actually all animal testing labs. So it was not something that would sit well with anyone who wanted to invest in that fund. And I think companies will quickly realize that today's investors are doing a little bit more drilling down. They do want to see the names of the companies that they're putting their money into when they're investing in a fund or whatnot, and that I hopefully those don't last long, and the greenwash continues to get sniffed out and shut down. But yeah, I would say to ask your bank though directly, and ask your personal finance advisors for their thoughts, just to keep the pressure on, and tell them that you're looking for something that aligns with your values, because a lot of the banks aren't even delivering at this point. So if they hear from their consumers, that will help them actually help drive some of that change, hopefully, moving forward.
Okay. We have a question here from Vicky Sharp. ESG, sort of environmental social governance, incorporation by boards seems to be slow despite all the chatter. What have we observed during the latest crisis in terms of with our analysis? So what have we observed? I have a few observations, but if somebody wants to go first, or I can while somebody's thinking. So it's interesting looking at, in France, they announced a large government aid package, wage subsidies and the like, and it was available to some of the more profitable billion-dollar luxury good companies and the like, and some of them were planning on taking that aid, even though they didn't need it to get by, just because it was there on the table. They didn't want to say no to free money. And then other companies had board meetings, and they decided, look, this is not a time to be sticking our hand in the trough. We're in a crisis. We can get by. This is not meant for us. There are a lot of people who can't get by. We don't have unlimited funds. So we are going to make a public policy position of we're going to get through this ourselves, and we're not going to go accept the bailout funds. And then it put a lot of pressure for more board meetings from those other companies who are planning on collecting some of that money. And so we see that kind of conversation is happening. And I think what we're seeing right now is we're seeing a lot of companies are watching this. They're not sure what's going to happen. A lot of them are seeing a hit to the business. They're fearing a W type recession, a couple of recessions, a couple of years of downturn, and they're trying to survive. And so they don't, they're not sure what to do. But, you see banks cutting dividends and share buybacks in some parts of the world, not so much in other parts, such as in Canada, because, the time of the crisis, you wanted to make sure you have enough to be stable and get through it. You see this same thing happening with energy companies. But it's really interesting that the key takeaway here is the boards are talking, people are in frequent contact. This is this is top of the agenda, and changes that would take sometimes a year or 2 years to push through. We're seeing this stuff happen in a matter of days in terms of corporate reversals and positions, and especially if other leaders in their sector act, it's having a really strong, rapid ripple effect on their peers. And so I think this is the time where we can get a lot of amplification and returns out of individual companies stepping up to the plate. And I think the reason they're stepping up to the plate is they kind of recognize, you can lead this change, you can follow the change, it's better to lead the change. But people are not looking out for companies to maximize returns for shareholders right now. That outdated notion of a company's only job to serve shareholders is an anachronism that is going to go in the dustbin of history, and legally is already there in most jurisdictions. And I think people now are starting to look at companies and say, what are you going to do for your country or for your community or for your planet? And specifically at the nation state level, this is something that's resonating with business leaders. And so I think we've only seen probably 10% of what makes sense for them to do. to be long-term entities that enjoy the trust and enduring trust of the stakeholders they need. But I'm hopeful that with more agitation and more people, leaders stepping up to the plate, that we can see a 10x in some of the leadership moves that we've seen so far. And we have a future on this, Adria, it's called COVID nights, like corporate nights. We're trying to track all this stuff at corporate nights that Rick Spence, the former editor publisher at Profit and National Post, entrepreneurship journalist, is covering for us. I didn't mean to do a plug for that, but it seemed to be relevant. It's free. Yeah, it's free. Sorry, yeah. So yeah, does anybody else want to pipe in there in terms of like if they're seeing discussions at the highest levels of businesses, or hearing that, in terms of how they're responding to this crisis in a more proactive, productive, progressive way?
I think you said that very well. The only thing I would add is to reiterate what I said before about, it seems like there really are internal discussions that are being had at a lot of companies in a more alarmist tone that might be driving this in the future too. People are really grappling with the potential effects of climate change, and I think that could accelerate this in the near term.
Yeah, I think so too. I think there's a momentum. We're kind of seeing we're at the end of the world now, so we're kind of moving. I think it's going to speed up, but also I'm afraid that we're going to fall back into the cracks, and come back to, regular as usual and wanting to go back. So I'm afraid of that too. But I really think the momentum is still there, as John, we know the youth movement is getting it's picking up steam. So I think there's certainly hope that this is going to go faster now.
So, okay, thanks. We have another question here from Fiona Burgess. What impact do you think the current health crisis will have on the aviation industry in terms of sustainability? Do you think there will be a green focused recovery in that industry? And if so, why?
I would like to see.
Adria, you were thinking about this for.
Yeah, I was about to actually research this topic, so I can't say that I'm well versed in it just yet. I was about to spend more time looking into it, but we hear a lot of talk about bailouts related to the aviation industry, and I think all bailouts, if they happen, when you're talking about carbon intensive sectors, should really be pegged to requirements around reducing their greenhouse gas footprint. And the airline industry is, perfect example of where this could work well. KLM, I think, is the only airline that's really, is on the top 50 actually for their use of biofuels. And biofuels, have their own issues. What I liked about KLM's biofuel was that actually it was palm oil free and it was largely made out of waste. And so there are some options. I know, Toby, you're plugged into a few more as well that are happening already. Innovations that are happening in aviation, and the main driver of the aviation and the airline industry was really just, cheap flights, as many cheap flights as you can offer. And I think that if we can tie any bailouts directly to them greening themselves, then we can start to see more dramatic progress. But I have the feeling that, the moment we, come out of the pandemic, one of the first things that will resume will be flights. People will be like, I've been in my house for so long, I need to take a vacation. But so we want to make sure that, we're using this opportunity, to green that recovery as much as possible. I know, Toby, you've done a bit of research before, heading into this possible next article on greening aviation. Did you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, I'm mindful of time because I'm just getting on top of the research too. At a sort of simple level, there's an opportunity for governments who are trying to get people back to work and industries to invest, to put out giant requests for proposals in terms of like departments of defense combined with commercial airlines for significant orders of sustainably sourced biofuels. And that will then focus the firms that can deliver this kind of stuff. Like right now, one of the biggest firms doing this is Neste out of Finland, which narrowly kind of missed the list, but it's one of these companies where they've gone from refining fossil fuels big time into biofuels. Some palm oil they're getting out, but transparently sourced, and also been pretty successful doing it. And then the other majors have really, outside of the first generation ethanol, we really have not seen as nearly as bold as the moves. And so something like this, like a sizable RFPs from as part of the recovery package for sustainable biofuels, that could be catalytic in focusing people's minds, I think. We have another question here, and we're 4 minutes away, and I want to have 30 seconds for parting thoughts, words of inspiration from the three of you. But this last question is what in general is most effective if a company really wants to start to move the dial on sustainability, on green stuff? What are the most effective strategies? Does anything kind of pop up for you guys in terms of kind of, nothing's clear for me in my mind, but does anything pop up, Pierre, for you? In terms of like, what makes...
Waste management is always a good place to start. So if you want to start, because for some reason, people can relate to this. You can even more tackle climate. In my mind, you can tackle easier. It's easier to tackle climate change if you talk about waste management. And this is kind of a funny thing, but it's kind of, people can relate to waste management. And then from then on, you can establish a, kind of a step-by-step program.
Okay. So cutting the fat. And then we have one last question here before we closing thoughts. Speaking of youth, both Fridays for Future and the Extinction Rebellion are wondering, what do they do after COVID? Forum for the or FTF in particular is disappointed in the lackluster response of governments. Have you or the presentation team seen recent indication that the youth movement is still strong and influential?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think that the youth movement is still quite strong and influential, and there's a lot happening this week around Earth Day 50 and the climate activists, climate strikes, digital climate strikes. We were working with a broad coalition of partners from the climate activist movement, including the youth climate groups, to do large-scale climate strikes in person back when there was a world where we had in-person events, which is no longer the case. But now things have shifted to online, and I think that there is a huge sort of momentum behind those climate strikes. And I think that when things get back to normal, we will continue to see that in person. But I mean, if anyone is adept at using social media, it's teenagers. So I think that if anyone's not going to be fazed by this, it's a lot of the youth strikers. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's absolutely alive and well.
Okay, well, thanks. Parting words for people to go on their way. Maybe start with you, Adria, Pierre, and then John to close it out.
I think it's a point that we mentioned in the article on the Green 50. It is really worth remembering that we do have a good track record of fixing planetary scale problems when we set our mind to it. We laid out a list of like every country in the world using unleaded gas now, other than two, the phase out of DDT, the elimination of CFCs, etc. And now we have this moment where, we do see a global scale push to, transform and rescue the economy. And let's use this moment, let's use this opportunity, let's use this crisis. A lot of us are experiencing deep loss during this time of the pandemic. We lost our aunt to COVID, but I do hope that in this moment of suffering, we see an opportunity to transform and do things better, and take this day to really lay out our vision for the world we want to see, and work dedicatedly towards that.
Maybe it's a chapeau to all these corporations that did something good for the planet in the last 50 years. So keep on rocking and keep on doing the right things, because you see, we say in French, we chiale a lot, we complain a lot. The environmentalists are seen as chialeux, but we can support too, and shout out to and chapeau to all these 50 corporations.
And I'll keep it quick because I know we're out of time, but I think anyone in the environmental community really believes that we need systemic change. So really transformational change across the public and private sector, but you need buy-in. And you need individuals and organizations to be on board. So I think that this list is really great in terms of highlighting, here's what various people are doing, various companies are doing, taking their own initiative. There's some inspiring examples there to chart a path forward.
Okay, well, thanks. That's a good note to end on. And wish everybody to stay safe, and let's recover greener. Okay, take care.
Happy Earth Day.
Happy Earth Day.
Okay.